The gun camera film ran for 47 seconds. Captain David Pressman watched it twice in the screening room at 5th Air Force Intelligence Nagoya, rewound it, and watched it again. The footage showed an F-86 Sabre closing on a MiG-15 from the 5 o'clock low position. Textbook bounce, clean tracking, a 2-second burst from the .650 caliber Brownings that raked the MiG's fuselage from tail root to cockpit. The MiG rolled left, streamed white vapor that turned black, and dropped below the camera frame trailing fire. A clean kill. Pressman had reviewed hundreds of these reels since 1951. He knew what a confirmed shoot-down looked like on celluloid, and this qualified without question. The problem sat on his desk in the form of a sortie log that didn't match. No pilot name corresponded to that aircraft's tail number for that date. The Sabre, serial number 51-2973, had not been scheduled for any combat mission. It carried no mission order. No flight plan existed. The wing operations officer at Kimpo had flagged the discrepancy 3 days after the engagement because the gun camera magazine came back exposed, which meant someone had fired the weapons, which meant someone had flown the airplane into MiG Alley and pressed the trigger. Pressman pulled the maintenance logs. The aircraft had been listed as down for a hydraulic pump replacement. If you've ever served, or if someone in your family turned wrenches, loaded ordnance, or flew anything with wings in Korea or anywhere else, drop their name and unit in the comments. Like and subscribe so these stories reach the families who've never heard them. Told right. Pressman sent a TWX message to the 51st Fighter-Interceptor Wing requesting clarification on the sortie. The reply, dated 3 days later, contained a single line that he later described to a colleague as the most unusual sentence I'd read in 18 months of war. The wing's response stated, "Aircraft 51-2973 flown by Airman 2nd Class, name redacted, crew chief, Baker flight, not a rated pilot." Not a rated pilot. Pressman set the message down. He picked up the gun camera reel canister and turned it over in his hands as though the metal itself might explain something. An Airman 2nd Class held the 3rd lowest enlisted rank in the Air Force. A crew chief maintained fighters. He did not fly them. He certainly did not fly them into combat over the Yalu River, engage a Soviet-built interceptor piloted by God knows who, Chinese, North Korean, possibly Russian, and shoot it down. That sequence of events violated so many articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that Pressman reportedly stopped counting at 7. Yet the film didn't lie. 47 seconds of gun camera footage showed a MiG-15 dying, and the only human being aboard the Sabre that killed it held no wings, no commission, no flight authorization of any kind. The operations log at Kimpo for that morning showed the aircraft's engine run up at 0742. Tower communications records for that window are missing. Whether lost, misfiled, or removed, the file doesn't say. What survives is the crew chief's account, given first to his squadron commander, and later, under considerably less friendly circumstances, to a JAG officer. How did a mechanic get an F-86 off the ground? The Sabre's cockpit sat 37 feet from nose to tail on an airframe that weighed 10,800 pounds empty, powered by a General Electric J-47 turbojet producing 5,970 pounds of thrust. It required no co-pilot, no backseater, no second pair of hands. A single man who understood the startup sequence, fuel boost, pump on, throttle to idle cutoff, hit the starter, advance to idle, could have that engine turning in under 90 seconds. Every crew chief in the 51st Wing knew the sequence cold. They performed engine runs daily. Getting airborne took knowledge. Finding a MiG and killing it took something else entirely. He could tell you what was wrong with a J-47 by the smell of its exhaust. That line came from Lieutenant Robert Farrell, Baker Flight's assistant operations officer, in a 1953 letter to his wife that ended up in the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell. He meant Staff Sergeant Dale Heckman. Heckman arrived at K-13 Suwon in March of 1952, 23 years old, from a town called Mineral Point in southwestern Wisconsin with a population under 3,000. He'd enlisted at 17 with a forged birth certificate, a detail the Air Force either never caught or chose to ignore, and sources conflict on which. By the time he reached Korea, he'd already served 4 years and held the crew chief slot on an F-86E tail number 51-2747 assigned to the 25th Fighter-Interceptor Squadron. The flight line at K-13 smelled like JP-4 kerosene and hot aluminum. Heckman worked it 12 hours a day, sometimes 16, in temperatures that dropped below 0 Fahrenheit between November and March and climbed past 95 in the Korean summer. The J-47 engine sat in the aft fuselage behind a firewall, accessible through panels held by Zeus fasteners that his fingers could turn without looking. He changed turbine wheels, replaced combustion liners, adjusted fuel nozzle spray patterns, swapped generators. Each task demanded specific torque values, specific clearances measured in thousandths of an inch. Heckman kept a notebook, green canvas cover, spiral bound, where he logged every discrepancy he found and every correction he made. That notebook survived. It sits in a private collection in Madison. The handwriting is small, precise, engineer's print. What made him different from the other crew chiefs on the line? He flew, not officially, not legally, but persistently. Heckman had talked 3 different pilots into letting him occupy the cockpit during post-maintenance check flights, a violation serious enough to end a career for both the pilot and the mechanic. The check flights lasted 15 to 20 minutes, low-altitude circuits around the airfield at speeds under 300 knots. Heckman sat in the seat. The pilot stood on the wing and talked him through radio. At least that's the version Farrell recorded. Whether a rated pilot actually rode along on any of these flights remains unclear. The maintenance officer for the 25th, Captain Gene Rossbach, apparently knew and looked the other way. Rossbach had his own problems. He'd lost 2 Sabres to engine failures that month and needed every competent wrench turner he could keep. Heckman carried the entire aircraft in his head. The fuel system ran at 28 pounds per square inch. Hydraulic pressure should read 3,000 pounds per square inch on the ground. The gunsight pipper drifted left when the radar ranging unit overheated, and the stall speed clean sat around 124 knots. Above Mach 0.86, the ailerons got heavy. He knew these things not from a manual, but from listening to pilots debrief while he inspected their airplanes, running his hands along control surfaces still warm from Mach buffet, feeling for the skin wrinkles that indicated stress loads beyond design limits. The warmth of a wing panel told him how hard the airplane had worked. Cold spots meant something different than hot spots. Rivets that had shifted even a 32nd of an inch spoke a language he'd taught himself to read. The operations desk at K-13 occupied a Quonset hut that rattled when the wind came off the Yellow Sea, and it stank of mimeograph ink, cigarette smoke, and the particular sour tang of coffee that had been reheating on a hot plate since before dawn. Master Sergeant William Orcutt ran it. He controlled a scheduling board, a 4x8-foot sheet of painted plywood with magnetic name tags and grease pencil annotations that determined which pilots flew which aircraft on which missions into MiG Alley. Every combat sortie that left K-13 passed through Orcutt's board first. If your name tag didn't move from the available column to a mission slot, you stayed on the ground. Orcutt answered to the wing operations officer, Colonel Frank Grunwald. But in practice, Orcutt's board functioned as the final authority on who fought the air war over northwestern Korea on any given morning. Heckman had applied twice for pilot training. The first application went forward in June of 1952 through the Standard Airman Education and Commissioning Program pipeline. It required a commanding officer's endorsement, passing scores on the Aviation Cadet Qualifying Examination, a Class 1 flight physical, and at least 2 years of college credit or equivalent. Heckman had the physical. He had the test scores, reportedly in the 92nd percentile, though the original score sheet hasn't surfaced. He did not have the college credits. His formal education ended at Mineral Point High School, class of 1947. The application came back disapproved in August with a form letter that cited insufficient academic qualification. Heckman filed a second application in November, this time through an alternate pathway that allowed exceptional enlisted candidates to substitute operational experience for academic requirements. Rossbach endorsed it. Farrell wrote a supplemental recommendation calling Heckman the most mechanically intuitive airman I have encountered in 11 years of service. Request disapproved. Critical MOS shortage. No replacement available. That stamp killed the second application in January of 1953. The Air Force needed crew chiefs more than it needed pilot candidates. Heckman's own competence had become the bureaucratic instrument that kept him on the ground. So, what did the operations desk actually control? More than scheduling. Orcutt's board tracked aircraft availability, fuel allocations, ordnance loads, spare parts status, and pilot duty hour limits under 5th Air Force Regulation 35-7. A pilot who exceeded 110 combat hours in a 30-day period got pulled from the rotation regardless of his preferences. The board also tracked maintenance status, which aircraft sat in flyable condition, which ones needed inspections, which ones had been red-crossed for mechanical defaults. An aircraft listed as down for maintenance didn't appear on the flyable column. It existed in administrative limbo. It went unscheduled, untracked, and, as far as the operations desk was concerned, incapable of moving under its own power, let alone taking off, flying north, and engaging enemy aircraft. Tail number 51-2973 occupied that limbo on the morning in question. Heckman had completed the hydraulic pump replacement the previous evening. The aircraft needed a functional check flight before returning to the flyable line, a flight that required a rated pilot, a maintenance release form signed by the crew chief and the maintenance officer, and a slot on Orcutt's board. None of these existed. Rossbach hadn't signed the release because Heckman hadn't submitted it. The aircraft sat on the south hardstand, fueled, armed with a full combat load of 1,772 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition across all 6 guns, and completely invisible to the operations desk. I think the arming detail matters more than anything else in this sequence. A post-maintenance check flight required no ammunition. The guns should have been empty. Why they carried a full combat load after a hydraulic pump replacement is a question the maintenance records don't answer. Heckman's JAG testimony addresses it in a single sentence that reads like a man choosing his words with extreme care. The aircraft had not been downloaded following its previous scheduled mission. Nobody had pulled the ammo. The airplane sat there loaded, repaired, and forgotten by every tracking system the 51st Wing maintained. What does a man think about in the 11 seconds between advancing a throttle and feeling the wheels leave the ground? The scramble order came at 07:31 on the morning of February 19, 1953. Radar at Chodo Island had picked up a formation of 16-plus MiG-15s crossing the Yalu southbound at 35,000 feet. Every flyable Sabre at K-13 launched. Orcutt's board emptied in under 4 minutes. Pilots sprinted across frozen taxiways, ground crews pulled chocks and safing pins, and the J-47 engines screamed to life in sequence down the flight line, like a chain of firecrackers lit from the same match. Heckman stood on the south hardstand and watched them go. 14 Sabres taxied out. 2 more followed from the north revetments. The tower cleared them in pairs, 30-second intervals, and K-13 fell quiet in a way that only an emptied fighter base can. The ringing absence of turbine noise replaced by wind and the distant thump of a generator. 51-2973 sat behind him, fueled, armed, repaired, invisible. His JAG testimony describes what happened next in 13 words. I performed a pre-flight inspection, strapped in, started the engine, and taxied. The JAG officer asked him to elaborate. Heckman declined. Farrell's account, assembled from conversations with line crew who witnessed the departure, fills in what Heckman wouldn't say. 2 airmen from the armament shop saw him climb the boarding ladder. One called out to ask what he intended. Heckman didn't answer. The J-47's starter whine cut across the hardstand at 07:39, and by 07:42, the Sabre rolled onto runway 32 without a tower clearance, without a call sign, without a single human being in the operations chain aware that it had moved. He took off into a crosswind out of the northwest at 12 knots. The climb to 30,000 feet in an F-86E took approximately 6 minutes at military power. Heckman had never been above 5,000 feet. The cockpit pressurization system maintained a cabin altitude of roughly 14,000 feet at that height. Breathable, but thin enough to dull reflexes if you weren't accustomed to it. The oxygen mask fed him through a regulator he'd serviced dozens of times, but never worn at altitude. At 30,000 feet, the outside air temperature dropped to minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost formed on the inside of the canopy where his breath hit glass. He flew north. He had no wingman, no element lead, no GCI controller feeding him vectors, just an empty sky and a heading. The radar gun sight, an A1CM computing unit that required manual range input, glowed amber on the combining glass in front of his face. He'd calibrated hundreds of them. He'd never looked through one at an airplane trying to kill him. I followed the river. That single line from the JAG transcript places his route along the Chongchon, the same ground reference every Sabre pilot used to navigate toward the Yalu. The river bent northwest, and the MiGs lived on the other side of it, at bases in Antung and Tatunko that American aircraft could not legally strike. Heckman crossed into MiG Alley alone, at 31,000 feet, at approximately Mach 0.82. The 16-plus MiG formation that triggered the scramble had already engaged the Sabres from K-13 somewhere over Sinuiju. Heckman flew straight into it. The gun camera on an F-86E mounted behind a small glass port in the upper lip of the intake, just left of centerline. It ran 16mm black and white film at 16 frames per second, triggered automatically when the pilot depressed the gun button on the control stick. The film cartridge held enough stock for roughly 60 seconds of continuous shooting. Heckman's cartridge recorded 47 seconds of usable footage. The remaining 13 seconds captured nothing but sky and the blurred edge of a wingtip in a high G-turn. The engagement started from above. Heckman came over the top of the furball at 31,000 feet and saw, for the first time in his life, enemy aircraft in combat. Silver MiG-15s turning with olive-drab Sabres in a rolling, descending carousel of contrails and muzzle flashes south of the Yalu Bend. The Soviet-built fighters carried red nose markings. This identified them as aircraft from the 303rd IAD, a guards division staffed by Soviet pilots rotating through Manchuria under Chinese cover designations. These weren't Green Chinese or North Korean students. They flew combat with accumulated skill from the Great Patriotic War, and they handled the MiG-15 like men who understood exactly what it could do. One of them separated from the fight trailing a thin line of gray smoke, not fire, probably a compressor stall or a nick in a fuel line. Minor damage. The pilot descended through 28,000 feet in a shallow left bank, heading north toward the Yalu and the sanctuary of Manchurian airspace. Standard procedure: disengage, cross the river, land at Antung, fix the airplane, fly again tomorrow. Heckman rolled in behind him. The closure rate on a descending MiG with a damaged engine sat around 50 knots overtake. Heckman's A1CM gun sight needed a wingspan input to compute lead, 33 feet for a MiG-15, a number every Sabre pilot memorized and every crew chief who calibrated the sight also knew. He dialed it in. The ranging radar locked. The pipper settled. At approximately 900 feet of range, he pressed the gun button. 6 M3. Browning 50 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously at a cyclic rate of 1,100 rounds per minute each. The combined recoil force exceeded 2,000 pounds, enough to decelerate the aircraft by several knots in sustained fire. The tracers, every fifth round, drew 6 converging lines of light that met at a point just behind the MiG's wing route. The gun camera caught what happened next in merciless clarity. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled backward from the fuselage. A flash erupted near the tailpipe, fuel igniting against hot turbine metal. The MiG's left wing dropped, then dropped further, and the aircraft entered a tightening spiral with orange flames streaming from its midsection in a corkscrew pattern that matched the rotation. The Soviet pilot did not eject. The records from the 303rd IAD, partially declassified after 1991, list a senior lieutenant Yevgeny Akimov as missing in action on February 19, 1953. Aircraft lost to enemy fire south of the Yalu River, circumstances under investigation. His body and wreckage landed somewhere in the mountains of North Korea. The crash site has never been located. Heckman fired for 3.2 seconds. At the combined cyclic rate, that meant approximately 350 rounds left the aircraft. How many struck the MiG? Film analysis conducted by 5th Air Force Intelligence estimated between 15 and 25 impacts, concentrated in a 4-foot section of the aft fuselage. A trained fighter pilot averaging 2% hits in a tracking shot considered that a good pass. Heckman's hit rate fell within normal combat parameters. His hit rate bothered people more than the stolen airplane. A crew chief with no formal flight training, no air-to-air gunnery practice, no combat experience, had produced a firing solution indistinguishable from what a rated pilot would achieve. Captain Pressman noted this in his intelligence summary with a single dry observation: marksmanship consistent with trained personnel. Heckman turned south after the kill. He descended below 20,000 feet, found the Changchun again, followed it home. The flight lasted approximately 48 minutes from takeoff to touchdown. He landed at K-13 at 0828, taxied back to the South Hardstand, shut down the engine, climbed out, and began a post-flight inspection of the aircraft he had just stolen. 2 armed APs from the base security squadron met him on the hardstand before he finished checking the tire pressures. Heckman saluted the APs and asked if he could finish his post-flight before they took him in. They let him. He checked the tire pressures, noted a small hydraulic seep on the left main strut, unrelated to his pump replacement, and logged it on a maintenance form he pulled from his cargo pocket. Then he walked to the security office between 2 armed men, still wearing his flight gear. The JAG proceeding convened 11 days later at K-13. Colonel Grunwald wanted a court-martial. Theft of government property, unauthorized operation of a military aircraft, violation of flying regulations, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The charges stacked high enough to put Heckman in Leavenworth for a decade. But the 51st Wing had a problem. A court-martial meant a public record. A public record meant explaining how an enlisted crew chief with no flight training stole a fighter jet from an active combat base, flew it into enemy airspace, shot down a Soviet pilot, and landed safely, all while the entire operations chain sat unaware. 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nagoya made a phone call. The charges disappeared. Heckman received non-judicial punishment under Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Reduction in rank from Staff Sergeant to Airman First Class, forfeiture of 2 months' pay, and reassignment to a transport maintenance unit at Tachikawa, Japan. The gun camera film went into a classified intelligence file. His maintenance log for that morning lists the hydraulic pump replacement and nothing else. The matter has been resolved administratively and requires no further action. That line closes the last document in Heckman's service record that references February 19th. Pressman's intelligence summary, the one that noted marksmanship consistent with trained personnel, went to 5th Air Force's classified archives. Sources conflict on whether a copy reached Far East Air Force's headquarters in Tokyo. The kill never appeared in the 51st Wing's official tally. Senior Lieutenant Akimov's MiG stayed off the scoreboard. So, the Air Force buried it. Why did the story survive? Orcutt talked. Farrell wrote letters home. The 2 armament airmen who watched Heckman climb that boarding ladder told every crew chief at K-13 within 48 hours, and crew chiefs rotated stateside. And stateside they told other crew chiefs at Nellis and Luke and George and Williams, and the story mutated with each telling. Sometimes he shot down 2 MiGs, sometimes 3, sometimes he landed with fuel gauges on 0 and bullet holes in the tail. The Corps held. An enlisted man flew a Sabre into MiG Alley and came back with a kill. The details wandered, but the architecture stayed intact, carried forward through maintenance shops and NCO clubs and reunion dinners and barroom arguments for decades, running ahead of every classification stamp the Air Force could put on it. Heckman served out his remaining tour at Tachikawa changing tires on C-124 Globemasters. He separated from the Air Force in September of 1953 at the rank of Airman First Class. His DD-214 lists his military occupational specialty as aircraft maintenance technician. It mentions no combat action, no decorations beyond the standard Korean Service Medal, no flight time. He returned to Mineral Point, Wisconsin, took a job at a John Deere dealership servicing diesel engines, and apparently never spoke about February 19th to anyone outside his immediate family. He died in 1997. His obituary in the Mineral Point paper ran 4 lines and identified him as a Korean War veteran. The morning after Heckman's flight, Orcutt's board filled up again. 16 Sabres launched at 07:15 against a fresh MiG formation crossing the Yalu. The pilots climbed north through clear skies over the Chongchon. On the south hardstand, a new crew chief, Heckman's replacement, a kid from Tennessee whose name the records don't preserve, started a pre-flight inspection on 51-2973, checking tire pressures.